October 1897. High in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, the first frost came early that year. It crept down from the ridgelines before dawn, silvering the grasses and stiffening the ground while most of the valley still slept. In the hollow below Hazel Creek, smoke rose from chimneys where families burned through their winter wood faster than they liked to admit. Everyone was preparing in the usual ways. Everyone except one woman. While her neighbors were sealing windows and stacking corn, Maeve Holloway was hauling stone. She worked alone on a narrow shelf of land cut into the mountainside, her skirts tucked and pinned, her sleeves rolled high despite the cold. The rock she dragged was rough limestone, heavy enough that she had to rock it free, inch by inch, before levering it onto a crude sled. From the road below, the work looked foolish, pointless, maybe even cruel. People stopped to watch. "Stone won't keep out winter," Ezra Cole said, leaning on the fence rail across the creek. He was the kind of man folks listened to without realizing they were doing it. Broad shoulders, careful words, a deacon at church. "She ought to be putting up logs like the rest of us." Someone else laughed. Another shook their head. Maeve didn't look down. She didn't answer. She kept pulling. Up there with her was the widow everyone else had stopped seeing as a person. Lydia Boone stood near the edge of the clearing, thin as a fence slat, hands folded tight in front of her, as if she were afraid they might disappear. Lydia had buried her husband the previous spring, a shallow grave on borrowed land after the mine accident. Since then she had been moved from porch to porch, barn to barn, until even kindness wore thin. There was nowhere left for her to go. If you're watching this story unfold, you already know something the people in that valley didn't. You know that by the time the worst winter in a decade arrived, one house on that mountainside would still be warm. You know that the thing everyone dismissed would be the only thing that worked. And if you want to see how that happened, how a mountain woman built something no one believed in, stay with the story. Subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about place as much as people. Maeve Holloway had never planned to build a house that autumn. She was 52 years old, widowed herself, and known mostly for keeping to the old ways when everyone else was chasing new ones. Her cabin sat farther up the ridge, squat and low, half dug into the earth like a badger's den. She had built it decades earlier with her husband, following patterns taught to her by her grandmother. Patterns most folks now called backward. Stone on the north side, earth packed tight against the walls, windows small enough to count on one hand. Warmth came not from size, but from restraint. Maeve didn't speak much. When she did, it was usually to state something that would turn out, months later, to be true. That habit made people uneasy. It's easier to argue with opinions than with results. She had noticed Lydia Boone long before others did. Noticed the way the widow walked slower each week, the way her cough lingered, the way she stood just a little apart from conversations, like someone waiting to be told where to go. By late September, Maeve had made up her mind. "You'll stay with me for winter," she told Lydia one morning, not as a question. Lydia shook her head. "I can't be a burden." Maeve lifted a stone and turned it in her hands, testing the weight. "You'll freeze if you don't." That was the whole argument. What Maeve didn't say, what she didn't explain to anyone, was that her own cabin could not hold two people through winter. It was built tight for one, maybe two if they were healthy and strong. Lydia was neither. So Maeve chose something harder. She chose to build. The land she cleared was poor soil over bedrock, sloped enough that water ran fast after rain. No one had ever bothered with it. No one saw a reason to. but Maeve did. The mountain itself was the reason. She laid the first stones directly into the slope, cutting back into the earth so that the rear wall would sit below ground level. Cold air sinks, wind scours, earth holds. These were not theories to her. They were things she had felt in her bones since childhood. Ezra Cole walked up the path one afternoon, boots crunching on frost, and watched her set a stone into place with a wooden mallet. "You won't finish before snow," he said, not unkindly. Maeve didn't stop working. "Then I won't finish." "That woman needs a proper house." Maeve adjusted the stone until it seated with a dull, final sound. "This will be proper." He frowned. "No chimney, no logs. What is it then?" "A wall that remembers summer," she said. Ezra shook his head, the way a man does when he thinks he's witnessing stubbornness instead of preparation. "You're risking her life." Maeve finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady. "No, I'm betting it." The backstory people told later was simpler than the truth. They said Maeve was eccentric. They said she was lucky. They said she'd guessed right. What they didn't understand was the method. Each stone was chosen for mass, not shape. She fit them tight without mortar, letting weight and gravity do the holding. The gaps were packed with clay and ash. The roof beams were low and thick, cut from chestnut before blight took them all. Over that, she layered bark, sod, and finally earth again. It wasn't a house meant to show itself. It was meant to disappear. Lydia helped where she could, fetching water, sorting stones by size, her hands cracking and bleeding despite gloves. She apologized constantly. "You don't need to speak so much," Maeve told her one evening as the sun slid behind the ridge early. "Save your breath." "People are talking," Lydia said quietly. "They always are. They say it won't hold, that it'll cave in." Maeve tamped earth with her foot, testing the firmness. "It's held for 1,000 winters already. We're just borrowing it." By November, snow came hard and fast. The road iced over. One by one, families retreated into their log houses, stacking quilts against doors, stuffing rags into cracks. Smoke hung low in the valley, a sign of fires burning day and night. Ezra Cole stood on his porch one morning, watching Maeve and Lydia disappear into the hillside. He felt a twist of unease then, not because he believed in the house, but because if he was wrong, someone would die. Inside the earth-sheltered room, the air was still, cool but not biting. The walls smelled of damp stone and clay. A small fire burned low in a shallow hearth, more ember than flame. Lydia held her hands out and felt warmth. Not heat. Warmth. "Why isn't it colder?" she asked. Maeve set a kettle on the coals. "Because the mountain doesn't forget yesterday just because today is cold." Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees by nightfall. Inside, the stone walls gave back what they had stored all summer, slowly, steadily, without asking for more wood than Maeve could spare. Lydia slept without coughing for the first time in weeks. No one in the valley knew that yet. They would. The real test hadn't come, not even close. And when it did, the thing everyone laughed at would become the only place left standing between life and cold. November turned to December the way it does in the high country, not with ceremony, but with subtraction. Daylight shortened, color drained. The last leaves clung to the oaks like stubborn hands until the wind took them one bitter night and left the woods bare as bone. The creek that ran below Hazel Hollow narrowed into a black ribbon between shelves of ice. Sound changed too. Footsteps became sharper. Axes rang longer in the cold air. Even voices seemed to travel farther, as if the mountain had less to absorb. In the valley, people measured winter by what they could see: the height of the snow on a fence post, the thickness of ice in a water bucket, how often smoke came from a neighbor's chimney. Up on Maeve Holloway's slope, winter was measured by other things: by how deep the frost line traveled into the ground, by whether the earth above the roof stayed soft enough to press a thumb into, by the way the stone wall behind the hearth felt when you leaned your back against it at night. Lydia Boone learned quickly that the house Maeve had built was not a place you simply occupied. It was a place you tended, like a garden, like an animal. Maeve showed her how to keep the fire low and steady, not roaring, not greedy. A hot fire eats wood and gives back heat too fast, the way a man with loose money spends it. A low fire, banked with ash, burns slowly and leaves coals that can be coaxed back to life with a breath and a handful of kindling. "Wood is time," Maeve told her, laying 2 small splits at the edge of the ember bed. "Don't waste it trying to impress the cold." The hearth was shallow, built of flat stone, and the chimney, if you could call it that, was a narrow channel cut through the roof, lined with clay and stone so it wouldn't catch. The smoke rose in a thin, reluctant stream and disappeared quickly, not announcing itself to the valley the way other chimneys did. That was the first thing Ezra Cole noticed. He walked the road below Maeve's slope in early December, carrying a sack of feed on one shoulder, and stopped when he realized he could not see her smoke. Not in the morning, not at dusk, not even on the days when the wind came hard out of the northwest, and every other chimney in Hazel Hollow was a gray flag of survival. He stood there longer than he meant to. His brother-in-law, Calvin, caught up with him, stamping his boots. "What are you staring at?" Ezra lifted his chin toward the hillside. "No smoke." Calvin squinted. "Maybe she's out of wood." Ezra didn't like the way that sounded. Maeve Holloway did not run out of wood in December unless something had gone wrong. "She's got that widow up there," Calvin added, as if remembering a detail he'd rather forget. "If they're cold, they'll come down." Ezra watched the slope. "Or they won't." Calvin chuckled, dry. "You fret too much." Ezra didn't answer because it wasn't fretting he felt. It was the uncomfortable sensation of seeing a pattern you can't yet name. That same week, a storm came in with a sky the color of lead. The first snow fell soft, then the wind hardened it into needles. Drifts built fast along the fence lines and filled the road, erasing the path between houses until everyone was isolated again. Each family a small island of lamplight in a sea of white. For most, isolation was familiar. They had planned for it. They had salted pork hanging, cornmeal stored, quilts layered. What they had not planned for was the cold that followed after the storm passed. The kind of cold that makes wood snap in the trees like gunshots. The kind that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground. On the 3rd night after the storm, Ezra's youngest boy woke up crying, his fingers pale and stiff. Ezra and his wife Martha rubbed the child's hands and feet, then carried him close to the hearth until the skin warmed and color returned. Martha's eyes held a fear she didn't speak. They burned more wood that night than they had planned. The next morning, Ezra went to the woodpile and saw the truth. Their stack was tall, but not tall enough. Not if this cold held, not if January came the way the old men sometimes warned it could. He stood there, counting in his head, not logs, but days. Across the valley, other families did the same math, quietly. No one wanted to admit it, because admitting it meant facing the next question. What do you do when your wood is gone and winter is not? In that tightening world, news traveled in small, sharp pieces. A cow slipped on ice and broke a leg. A man cut too close to his hand while splitting kindling in a hurry. A chimney caught and nearly took a roof with it before the neighbors arrived with buckets. And then there was the talk, whispered first, then spoken openly when the whispering didn't solve anything. Maeve Holloway's place was warm. It started with a boy named Thomas Fitch, who had been sent up the ridge to check traps. He came back with his cheeks red, not from windburn but from heat, and told his father he'd stopped at Maeve's hillside place to warm up. Warm up, his father repeated, incredulous.
Yes, sir,
the boy said, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something he wasn't sure he was allowed to mention.
It's warm in there like it's October.
That word spread faster than it should have, because it fed something the valley was trying not to feel: hope, and the resentment that sometimes follows it. If warmth existed, people wanted to know why it wasn't theirs. If warmth existed, people wanted to know what it would cost. Ezra Cole walked up to Maeve's slope again 2 days later, this time not out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. The path was steep and slick. The air burned his lungs. When he reached the door, he hesitated. It wasn't a door in the way most folks thought of a door. It was heavy planks fitted tight, set into a frame that looked like it had been part of the mountain longer than Maeve herself. There was no draft around its edges, no whistling wind. When Ezra knocked, the sound was dull, as if the earth swallowed it. Maeve opened it after a moment. She didn't look surprised to see him. Ezra stepped inside and stopped. The air was warmer than the outside by more than he could explain. Not hot, not like standing too close to a roaring hearth. It was the warmth of stored bread, of hands after they've been rubbed back to life. It had weight to it. It wrapped instead of striking. Lydia Boone stood near the hearth, stirring something in a pot. Her cheeks held color. Her shoulders were less hunched. When she looked at Ezra, there was caution there, but also something else. A kind of quiet relief, like a person who has stopped waiting for the worst to happen every hour. Ezra took off his hat, suddenly aware of how loud his boots sounded on the packed earth floor. "I came to see if you needed anything." Maeve's gaze stayed on him, steady as always.
We have what we need.
Ezra cleared his throat. "I heard talk. Folks say it's warm in here." Maeve didn't smile.
Folks have mouths.
Ezra shifted. He glanced at the walls. They weren't just stone. They were stone backed by earth, thick enough that Ezra couldn't imagine the effort it took to set them. He saw the low ceiling, the small windows, the way the hearth sat against the rear wall, the way the floor sloped just a touch toward a drain channel cut into the packed clay so meltwater wouldn't pool. He had built houses before. He knew what went wrong in winter. Drafts, damp, too much open air to heat. He knew the way log walls would shrink and gap as they dried, how you had to keep stuffing moss and rags into cracks to keep wind from stealing the heat you had paid for with labor. Maeve's walls didn't crack. They didn't shrink. They just sat there, heavy and patient. "How?" Ezra asked before he could stop himself. Maeve turned and touched the stone beside the hearth with the back of her hand, like you might touch a horse's flank to feel if it was sweating.
Stone holds heat. Earth holds steadiness. Small space takes less to warm.
Fire stays low. Ezra frowned. But it was cold out days before you even finished. Maeve looked at him as if he'd asked why water runs downhill.
The cold is in the air. The air changes. The ground changes slow.
Lydia watched Ezra's face as understanding began to form in pieces, and with it something harder. A man's pride doesn't like being taught by what he dismissed. Ezra nodded once, slowly.
So you're using the mountain as insulation?
Maeve's eyes didn't brighten at the word.
She wasn't interested in being praised for knowing. I'm using what's here. Ezra stood there, feeling the truth of it settle. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was a set of choices, each one practical, each one resisting the urge to build big and showy, each one meant to keep warmth from escaping faster than a person could replace it. He realized, with a quiet sting, that he'd built his own house the way everyone else did, not because it was best, but because it was accepted.
Outside, the valley's skepticism hadn't softened. Not yet. If anything, it sharpened. The idea that Maeve had found a better way made some people angry, because it implied they had endured unnecessary hardship for years and called it normal. Calvin, Ezra's brother-in-law, voiced what many felt. "If it's so warm," he said one evening at the general store, "why ain't she sharing it with everyone? Why build something that hides in the ground like a fox den?" A few men laughed. Someone else, older, said quietly, "Maybe because if she built it like a showpiece, you'd all come take it." That shut the laughter down. The truth was, Maeve hadn't built the hillside house to be admired. She'd built it because Lydia Boone needed to live through winter. But the valley didn't see Lydia as reason enough. They saw Maeve's warmth as an asset, and assets in hard times make people think differently than they want to admit. By late December, the cold broke briefly. A thaw came, thin and deceitful. Snow softened. Roofs dripped. The creek swelled with meltwater, rushing fast beneath a skin of ice that cracked and shifted like something alive. People welcomed the thaw because it felt like mercy. Maeve didn't. She stood outside her hillside house one afternoon, looking at the slope above the roof. Lydia came out behind her, pulling her shawl tight. "It's warmer," Lydia said, hopeful. Maeve knelt and pressed her palm into the ground near the roofline. The top layer was softening. Beneath it, she could feel the stubborn cold still locked in. "This is when roofs fail," Maeve said. Lydia's hope faltered. "Because of the water?" Maeve nodded. "Water finds every weakness. It'll seep where wind never could. Then it freezes again, and that's when it breaks things." Lydia looked at the hill above them. "Is there a weakness?" Maeve stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "There always is. We just don't know where yet." That was the secret no one else understood about Maeve Holloway. She didn't believe in perfect plans. She believed in watching, adjusting, doing the next right thing before the mountain forced your hand. That evening, she took a shovel and cut a shallow diversion trench uphill from the roof, angling it so meltwater would run around the house instead of over it. She lined the trench with stones. She packed clay behind them. She worked until her fingers ached. Lydia tried to help, but Maeve stopped her. "Go inside," Maeve said. "You're warm now. Don't spend it." It was a small sentence, but it carried the weight of all winter. Warmth was not just comfort. It was a resource you managed. It was something you could lose by being careless, and once lost, you might not get it back. 2 nights later, the thaw ended with sudden cruelty. The temperature dropped hard, plunging below freezing before dawn. The meltwater that had seeped into cracks and channels froze solid. Trees snapped. Ice thickened on roofs. The creek, swollen and trapped, began to push against its own banks. The mountain went quiet again, the way it does before it decides what it will take. And in the valley, Ezra Cole woke to the sound of his chimney groaning, a deep, wooden complaint, and knew with sudden certainty that the winter had not yet shown its worst. The real cold arrived in January without warning, the way it often does when a mountain has been patient too long. It came down at night, silent and absolute, pressing itself into every crack and seam that human hands had ever left unfinished. By dawn, the valley sat under a sky so clear it felt sharpened, blue as broken glass. Breath smoked thick, metal burned skin. Even sound seemed brittle, as if it might shatter if spoken too loudly. Ezra Cole knew something was wrong before he opened his eyes. The house felt different, too still. The usual faint tick and settle of warming wood was gone. When he swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards bit cold through his socks. He crossed to the hearth and stirred the ashes. Nothing glowed beneath them. The fire had died in the night. He felt a flicker of irritation first, then a deeper, colder thing. He added kindling, struck a match, coaxed a flame. It caught reluctantly, as if the air itself didn't want to help. Smoke pushed back into the room before finally finding its way up the chimney. Martha stood behind him, wrapped in a shawl. "It's colder than yesterday," she said. Ezra nodded. Much. Outside, the valley was already awake, in the way people are when they're afraid. Doors opened and closed. Voices called out across yards. Someone shouted about frozen pumps. Another cursed when a bucket slipped and shattered on the ground. By mid-morning, word spread that old Mr. Halverson down by the bend had woken with ice on the inside of his windows, and no wood left dry enough to burn. His hands shook so badly he couldn't strike a match. A neighbor brought him embers in a bucket, but by then the chill had already set into his joints. The valley had seen hard winters before, but this one carried a different edge. The cold wasn't just sharp. It was persistent. It stayed through the day, through what little sun there was, refusing to lift. Ezra fed his fire steadily, but the woodpile shrank faster than it should have. Every time he opened the door to bring in more, the heat fled the room like a startled animal. He stuffed rags into gaps between logs, pushed furniture closer to the hearth, did everything he'd learned to do. Still the walls bled warmth. That afternoon, Calvin came over, his face tight. "My chimney's icing," he said. "Smoke won't draw right. House smells like soot." Ezra felt the thought he'd been avoiding rise up, fully formed. "Maeve's place doesn't have that problem." Calvin's jaw tightened. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm observing," Ezra said more sharply than he meant to. Calvin scoffed. "That hole in the hill? You'd trust your children to that?" Ezra looked at his youngest, sitting close to the hearth, cheeks flushed, too red now from the heat they were crowding. He thought of Lydia Boone, standing easy and upright in Maeve's stone-walled room. He thought of the quiet there, the steadiness. "I'd trust them to warmth," he said. Calvin left without answering. By evening, the creek below Hazel Hollow began to flood. Ice jammed against bends and shallow spots, backing water up until it spilled over the banks and crept toward houses built too close, too low. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the dark, sharp reports like distant rifle fire. Ezra went out with a lantern and saw water spreading where it had never been before, pooling beneath the Halversons' porch. The old man sat inside, wrapped in blankets, eyes glassy, breath shallow. Ezra and two others dragged him out, boots slipping in icy water, and carried him uphill to Ezra's place. They laid him near the hearth, but even with the fire burning hard, it wasn't enough. The cold had soaked too deep. Mr. Halverson's lips were blue. His hands didn't respond. "We need more heat," someone said. Ezra knew what that meant. A roaring fire, burning through wood they couldn't afford to lose. Heat that would surge and fade, leaving them worse off by morning. The thought settled on him like a weight, heavy and undeniable. Maeve Holloway's hillside house was warmer than any other place in the valley. Ezra straightened. "We're taking him up the ridge." A few men stared at him. "To her place?" one asked. Ezra met their eyes. "Unless someone has a better idea." No one did. They wrapped Mr. Halverson tighter and lifted him again, lanterns bobbing as they made their way up the icy path. The climb was slow. Breath came hard. But when Maeve opened the door, warmth spilled out, visible in the way their shoulders dropped, the way their hands unclenched without permission. Maeve took one look at the old man and nodded. "Bring him in." She didn't ask questions. She didn't lecture. She showed them where to lay him, how to keep the fire low, how to use the warmth already stored in the stone instead of trying to force more from the flames. Lydia knelt and rubbed Mr. Halverson's hands, her movements sure now, practiced. She was no longer the woman who had arrived trembling months earlier. She was someone who belonged in that space. They stayed for hours. The old man's breathing eased. Color returned slowly to his face. When Ezra stepped back outside near midnight, the cold struck him again. But it felt different now, less mysterious, less unbeatable. The next morning, the valley woke to a truth it could no longer ignore. Mr. Halverson was alive because of the hillside house, because of stone and earth and a fire that refused to be hurried. People came up the ridge in ones and twos at first, then in small groups. They didn't knock as loudly as they might have weeks earlier. They stood awkwardly, hats in hands, asking questions that were really admissions. "How thick are the walls? How deep did you cut into the slope? Does it always stay like this?" Maeve answered when it mattered. When it didn't, she let the house speak. Ezra watched the change move through the community like thaw water finding new channels. Calvin came up on the third day, eyes downcast. He stood inside the stone-walled room and said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I was wrong." Maeve looked at him, then back to her work. "That's fine." "No," Calvin said louder. "It matters. I was wrong." She nodded once. "Then you learned something." The cold held through January, but it no longer held the valley hostage. Families began cutting their fires lower, sealing drafts more carefully, paying attention to how heat moved and stayed instead of how fiercely it burned. A few men started talking about digging into south-facing slopes come spring, about stone foundations, about smaller rooms. Not everyone changed. Some never would. But enough did that the winter stopped being a thing endured alone. Lydia Boone survived the season. More than that, she grew strong again. By February, she was walking the ridge paths without stopping to catch her breath. She laughed sometimes, a sound the valley hadn't heard from her in a year. When spring finally came, slow and tentative, Maeve Holloway didn't claim credit. She never did. She simply went back to her own cabin, to her quiet work, to the habits that had kept her alive long before anyone thought to ask why. But the hillside house remained. A lesson set into the mountain itself. Proof that survival doesn't always come from building bigger, louder, faster. Sometimes it comes from listening to what the land has been telling you all along. And if you've ever wondered what wisdom your own place might be holding, what lessons are waiting just beneath the surface, that's something worth paying attention to. If this story made you think differently about how people live with the land instead of against it, let me know in the comments. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this, quiet, stubborn, and true, still waiting to be told.